Hi guys, welcome to the tutorial for the Chloe Corset pattern. I'm so excited to bring this pattern to you guys. It comes in sizes extra small through 2XL. We're gonna break this down step by step. You can also follow along in the booklet that comes along with the pattern. The download for this is in my bio. It is at my Etsy shop as well as my website, which is gonna be coming up very soon. Once you've gone and downloaded your pattern and printed it out, go ahead and cut your fabric pieces according to the paper pattern and meet me here. So I have all of my pieces laid out here. I have my cut pieces up top and then all of my bodice pieces at the bottom. This is every single one of my main fabric pieces. So you can see they're all mirrored. We have every single one cut out. Make sure you follow the instructions on the actual pattern to see how they're cut, but this is every single one of my main fabric pieces. Now our very first step, and there are a couple different types of interfacing you can use, but I'm going to add interfacing to the back of all my main fabric pieces. I'm using a medium to more heavyweight interfacing because I have a thinner fabric, and I'm gonna base stitch this to the back of my main fabric pieces. You can also use a fusible interfacing, so then you would iron it to the back, but you wanna make sure you have a good strength layer for your corset that's gonna help it hold everything in and also wrinkle a little bit less. Now I'm doing this for each of my main fabric pieces. You do not have to do the cups if you have foam. That's kind of an if you want to, you don't have to, because you're gonna have foam, so they'll have enough structure. I am not using foam, that is optional. So if you are using foam, you can skip doing the interfacing on your actual cut pieces and just do it on your structured bodice piece. But once I have all of my strength layer added to the backs of my main fabric pieces, I'm gonna take these and lay them out, and I'm gonna start by doing just one side. I like to do one side and then the other. So here's one side of my top. I'm gonna start with the center back and the side back, and I'm gonna take those and I'm gonna place them right sides facing, pin into place. Make sure you align all of those notches. And then once I have it pinned into place, we are gonna sew this down. We are sewing everything down with a 0.5-inch seam allowance. That's throughout the entire corset. It is also marked on your pattern. So once I have this all pinned in place, I will go to my sewing machine and I will sew this together. Once we've done that center back and side back panel, we are going to move on to our side front 2 piece, which is the one that I just picked up. We're gonna take that and we're gonna connect it to our side back, and we're gonna place those right sides facing, pin into place, and we are going to sew down again with that 0.5-inch seam allowance. Once our side front 2 has been sewn down, it should look like this. We're going to grab our side front 1, place our side front 2 right sides facing along our side front 1, pin into place, and then we will sew these 2 down just like we did all the other ones. And then finally, our last bodice piece for this side, we're gonna grab our center front and we are gonna place our side front 1 on top of it with right sides facing, pin in place from top to bottom right here, and then we will sew this down. Once that's done, you can see we have one whole side done right here. I'm gonna grab my other pieces and I'm just going to repeat the exact same steps for my opposite side. So we're not doing anything different. I like to start again from the center back, go to the side back, your side front 2, your side front 1, and then center front. Once you've repeated everything, you should have 2 pieces that look like this. We're gonna take one piece and place it right sides facing, and we're gonna pin our 2 center fronts together. Once we have that pinned all the way from top to bottom, we'll take that over to our sewing machine and sew it down into place. Now we've got all of our bodice pieces done. It should look like this. What we're gonna do is we are going to start pressing our seam allowance. So our seam allowance, everything except the center front is going to go towards the center back, away from the center front. So I'm gonna take this back panel piece right here. This center front, again, this is going to be flat. And then you can see I also have a tailoring hand. That's just gonna help with all of the curves, but all of the panel pieces besides the center front are going to go towards the center back, and these are gonna be sewn down to create our channels. And this might make a little bit more sense when I show you guys at the very end, but again, going towards the center back, away from the center front. And then once I get to that center seam, this is going to get pressed open right here. So we will have 2 channels at the center front. Then again, for the opposite side, going away from the center front and towards the center back. Once all your seam allowances have been pressed down in the correct direction, we are going to sew each one of these down. You're going to do that for each of your seam allowances. This is going to be the channels that your boning goes into. You can see what it looks like right here. But here I have this sewn down. Now we're not going to do our boning just yet. That'll be much, much later. But what we are going to do is grab our lining pieces and we're going to repeat every single step exactly like we just did. So go back if you need to, there's no changes, but we're gonna do the exact same thing for all of our lining pieces. So you got your lining done, you can put that away for now. We won't use that till a little bit later, but we're gonna grab our main fabric piece. We're gonna lay this out with the inside facing up, and you can see what I have marked is marked also on your paper pattern pieces, but this is where we're going to put our ribbon. This is going to help your corset with structure and also kind of help hold in that waist a little bit. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a piece of ribbon and I'm going to start pinning it away from where our seam allowance is sewn down. So kind of away from our channels, because we're going to sew this on the outside, which I will show you what I mean by that. But make sure you're not pinning where your actual seams are. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to pin this where all of my notches are, and then once I have this all pinned, I'll take this over to my sewing machine and I'll sew this from the right side. When I sew this from the right side, I'm going to stitch in the ditch, so meaning I'm just going to stitch over a seam that has already been sewn. That's why we don't want our pins too close to where those seams are, and I'll show you what this looks like. So it looks invisible on the outside, but on the inside you can see that my ribbon has been sewn down, and we're going to do that for each seam. So you can see what that looks like. It looks invisible from the right side, and we have got our ribbon in place. Now that we've got our ribbon in place, we are going to add our lining. Grab your lining piece once more, and we are going to place that right sides facing on top of your main fabric corset. Now we are going to pin along both sides and then all of the top edge, excluding the cups. I like to start this by I line up all my seams. You want to make sure that your seams are aligning for your lining and your main fabric, and then I'll normally go back in and kind of fill in the more I need. I like to use a lot of pins, so I make sure, especially with a slippery lining, you want to make sure it's not moving too much when you're sewing. And we're going to do both sides and then the entire top edge, just excluding those cups. You can see that middle piece is also pinned right there. And here's what it's going to look like after you have it all pinned. Both sides, 2 top edges, and that middle piece, the cups are excluded. And once I have that all pinned into place, I'm just going to sew down the lining to my main fabric. Once that's all done, I'm just going to trim off my seam allowance. So I'm going to make sure I do that all along the top edge, including the middle piece as well as the sides. This is going to help reduce bulk. Once that's done, I'm just going to flip this right sides out, and I'm going to give this a nice press. We want to make sure our edges are really crisp. Make sure you use something to poke out those corners. And I'm just going to press all along my top edge and my 2 sides. Once everything's been pressed, you can do an optional top stitch along that top edge if you would like to do a top stitch. I'm skipping a top stitch just because I don't want it on the outside of my fabric, but the next step that you do want to do that's not optional is to combine your main fabric and lining just at those cut pieces, and you're just doing a based stitch with this. I like to pin my seams together, so I make sure that my seams are aligning for my main fabric and my lining, and I'll pin these together again just because lining is also really slippery. I like to make sure I'm pinning things before I go. And again, this is just a base stitch, so I didn't film it. You just want to make sure that your lining and your main fabric under cup parts are combined. And once you've done that, we're actually going to move on to our actual cup pieces. So I have all of my cup pieces. I have my front cup, my back cup, and my upper cup. I highly suggest you don't skip this little step. It does help a lot, but I like to take and make a little mark on the back of my back cup. The cups are really similar. It's easy to get them confused, especially after you've sewn. So I just make a tiny little mark on my back cup, on the back of my back cup, and then I take my back cup and my front cup and I place them together right sides facing at that center seam. And then once I've got them pinned into place, I will sew these down. Once these two pieces are sewn together, I am going to press the seam allowance towards the back cup. Again, this is why it's really helpful to mark what the back part of your back cup is, because it's easy, again, once they're sewn together, to confuse what's what. I use a couple different methods of pressing. I kind of like to bend it and do it on my table. And then I also used my tailoring ham, which is really helpful when you're trying to press curves, but this just helps you make it get really nice and crisp. And again, that seam allowance is going towards the back cup. And once we've pressed it towards the back cup, we're gonna sew this down into place. Once that has been sewn, it should look like this right here. And now we're gonna take our upper cup piece and we're gonna place that right sides facing. This again is where it's really helpful to have that little mark that marks the back of your cup, because you won't get confused on what is the front and what is the back. It's really easy to turn these around and get mixed up which directions your cup went, or then accidentally sew them wrong. I've done that before. I've had people that have done my patterns that have done that before. It's really easy to mix them up. But once you have your upper cup all pinned into place, we'll take that over to our sewing machine and we will sew that down. Once that's sewn, we are going to press our seam allowance up onto the upper cup. So you can see, again, I like to use a couple different methods. I press it by kind of curving my cup on the table, and then I also use a tailoring ham. Once the seam allowance has been pressed up, we're going to take that over to our sewing machine, and just like we did our cups, we are going to sew down that seam allowance. Once that has been sewn, it should look like this. You can see I've got everything in order. All my seam allowance are sewn down, and we have done one of our cups. We're gonna press this on a tailoring ham just to make it a little bit neater and try to get out those wrinkles. And now I'm just going to repeat this for all of my other cup patterns. We will have 3 more, 1 more main fabric cup, and 2 more lining fabric cups. And once you've repeated this 3 more times, it should look like this. You should have 4 total cups, 2 main fabric, 2 lining. If you're adding foam onto your cups, you can sew those with your actual main cup pieces, or you can sew them separately, and so then you would actually have 5 more cups to sew, because you would also have foam cups. And we will combine all of them. So if you have foam, you can put that on top of your main fabric cup and then sandwich it in between your lining. If you don't have foam, or you sewed in your foam with your main fabric cup, you're just going to take your lining cup, place that right sides facing, and make sure it's the correct lining cup, because they should line up when they're right sides facing. And then you're gonna pin all the way along just the top edge of your cup. So we're only gonna sew down the top edge. So now that I have all of that pinned into place, I'll take this over to my sewing machine and sew it down. Now that that's been sewn, I'm just going to trim off that seam allowance. This is going to help reduce bulk. And then once I have that trimmed, I will flip this right sides out and then give it a nice press. I like to kind of pull my lining down when I'm pressing this, so I make sure it's underneath the main fabric. You can also do an optional top stitch at the top of your cup if you wish. Once all of that's done, we're going to pin together the bottom of our cup. When we pin this together, we are just going to pin this together for a base stitch purpose. So make sure you align your seams, but we are not going to do a 0.5 inch seam allowance, again, because this is just a base stitch. You can do this on your machine or by hand, but we just want to make sure that our lining is connected to our main fabric cup. So this makes it a lot easier when we finally sew them into our bodice. And once you've sewn that, it should look like this. So I have a little base stitch. I'm going to trim off some of my threads. And now we are just going to repeat this for our other cup, for our main fabric and our lining, and then also your foam if you have foam. Once that's been done, we are going to add our cups into our corset. Now this is easily the hardest part. Sometimes you have to do it more than once. You really kind of have to bend the corset because it's a curve. It is definitely not simple to add the cups. This is The hardest part of corset making is always adding the cups, so don't feel discouraged if you have to do it over and over again. I go really, really slow when I do this, and I also add a lot of pins, but I start my pin by lining up my seam, so that middle seam of your cup and that side front 1 and side front 2 seam should line up, and then I go through and pin all the way up to both sides. And again, I use a lot of pins. And just like all of our other pieces, this is right sides facing, so the right side of your cup is pinned to the right side of your corset. And here's what it's going to look like from the inside. So here's my lining, and that's the inside of my cup. And now I'm going to take this over to my sewing machine and start sewing this together. Again, I like to go really slow and just a little bit at a time when I am sewing the cups. I do eventually speed this up, but you can see how much I start and stop throughout this. I want to make sure that the bottom of my bodice where the cup is really straight, and that the cup is going on correctly, and also that it's fitting into the bodice perfectly. So again, I start and stop a lot. That is very sped up, so don't feel like you have to rush through the cups. Again, I think it's the hardest part. Once the cup is in, we're going to just cut little tiny slits into our seam allowance. So make sure you don't cut your sewing, just cut this into your seam allowance. And once I've got those slits throughout that curve, I'm actually going to grab my bias tape. If you don't have bias tape, make sure you go ahead and make your bias tape with some excess fabric. And we're going to take our bias tape, and it's basically going to cover that seam allowance is what we're going to do. So now that I've got my slits, I'm going to grab my bias tape. I'm going to open it up, and I'm going to take the bottom edge and place it along the edge of my seam allowance from the inside of my cup, just like this. For the middle part right there, I like to fold it over and pin it into place so the edges of my bias tape are touching, and then I'll pin this down. And then I'm going to continue that all the way along. So again, the bottom of my bias tape is hitting the edge of that seam allowance, and we're doing this from the inside of the cup. And I'll use a lot of pins for this. Again, I don't think you can use enough pins when it comes to cups because there is a curve and it's really easy to start getting off. But we're going to do this, and then we will sew down our bias tape once we have everything pinned into place. And it should look like this once you've got it all pinned. And we're only going to be sewing our bias tape to the seam allowance. Make sure you don't get up onto the cup or the bodice. This is just being sewn on to your seam allowance. And again, you can go really slow on this, use lots of pins. Once that's done, I've got my bias tape in. We are going to fold this over the seam allowance, just like you see me doing. This is going to hide that seam allowance. And now I'm not going to sew this just yet. I'm actually going to do a basting stitch. So I'm going to kind of pin this into place that folds over my seam allowance so it looks nice and neat from the inside. And then once I have all of my pins in place, I'm going to do this by hand. I'm going to do a basting stitch that holds down this seam allowance in place before I sew it down. And now I'll show you why I do this extra step, because it helps it look much more nice and neat at the end result. But this is what it looks like when I have it all pinned, and then here I am actually sewing it down by hand. You'll notice the side edge of the bias tape isn't sewn down like we did the center front, and that's because eventually that is where we're going to put our underwire in. If you're not doing an underwire, you can fold that down and go ahead and sew it down into place, but I like to leave it open for an underwire. And then once I have hand stitched all this is what it's going to look like. That hand stitching is now going to be my guide when I sew this down with my machine. So I sew this from the right side of my fabric, and I use that base stitch as my guide. So that way I make sure I'm catching the seam allowance, but that also I'm staying the correct distance from my cup. So this will look really nice and neat, both from the outside and the inside. All of our seam allowance will be covered, but then it'll also just look like one more stitch line right below our cup. So this is what that's going to look like. You can see I have my stitch line in place. I'm going to grab my seam ripper, and I am just going to take out all of those base stitches because we don't need them anymore. Once your base stitch is out, you can grab your underwire. If you're using it, it is optional, and we're just going to slide that into the channel that we've created from that side part. Once you've got your underwire in, I'm just going to fold over that side of my bias tape that isn't done. So I'm just gonna fold that in on itself, and I'm just gonna hand stitch this so you don't really see it from the front. And I'm just gonna close up that bias tape. Once you're done, it should look like this. Your cup should look clean from the inside and outside. You don't have any of that seam allowance showing. And now we're just gonna repeat this for our opposite cup. Once you've done that for both of your cups, I'm just going to add one more channel before we enter in our boning as we kind of get to the home stretch here. So we are going to mark 0.5 inches from our center back. This is also marked on your pattern, or you can do a ruler and mark it with some heat pen or a chalk. And basically I'm going to mark 0.5 inches from that center back. And then once I've got it marked, I'm going to sew down that line. And make sure you do this for both of your back panels. And that is the last channel you will add. Now we will just add all of our boning pieces. So I'm gonna grab my boning, and I'm gonna measure this from the top and then to 3/4 of an inch from the bottom. We wanna make sure we have enough room at the bottom because we do still have to add our bias tape after this. So make sure you leave, I like to leave a good 3/4 of an inch, and then cut all of our boning pieces. Once I've got my boning pieces cut, I don't just kind of cut off on my camera, but I do like to tape them up on the ends, or you can burn your ends. If you're using steel cage boning, you can cap them, but make sure you do something to your ends so that they don't poke out of your corset as you're wearing it. But once you've done that, you're just going to put them into their respective channels for whichever one you cut. And we're gonna do this for every single channel for your corset. Once I've placed all of my boning pieces, I am just going to pin my main fabric and my lining together. So I like to do this by aligning all of those seams. You want to make sure everything is in the right place. And I'm going to go throughout the entire corset, aligning all those seams, pinning them into place, and then I am just going to baste stitch the main fabric and lining bottom edges together. Once I have my base stitch done, I'm going to grab my long piece of bias tape. I'm gonna unfold it, and similar to like we did with the cups, I'm going to put the bottom edge of the bias tape along the bottom edge of my corset with right sides facing. And when I get to the ends right here, I'm gonna start and finish by folding the bias tape so that the right sides of the bias tape are touching each other. I'm gonna pin this into place, and I'll pin this all throughout my entire bottom corset. And then once I have this all pinned, I will sew down that bottom part of the bias tape with that 0.5 inch seam allowance. Once my bias tape has all been sewn, I'm going to flip this to the inside, and I'm going to flip my bias tape over twice essentially. So I'm going to flip it in on itself. Make sure those corners are pulled inside. This is going to help hide the corners, but I'm folding it in once on itself and then once again over the seam allowance. And then again, I like to use a lot of pins for this. I want to make sure my bias tape looks nice and neat. It is kind of your last step, so you want to make sure it's really coming together. So I like to use a lot of pins, and again, I'm folding this up into the inside. Make sure that it's going above where your front bias tape is sewn, because we're going to stitch in the ditch here. And we're going to stitch in the ditch from the right side, the outside of your corset. So that's why you want to make sure you definitely know that you're catching the bias tape on the inside. But I'll show you guys what that looks like. Here I am finishing up my pinning, and this is what it should look like. And now I have my corset right sides up, and I am stitching in the ditch of my original bias tape. So this way, this catches the bottom because I know it's over where I've already sewn on that seam allowance, and then it looks nice and neat from the outside as well. Once you've done that, you're just going to give your bias tape a nice press. You can see mine looks really wrinkly. We're going to press all that out so it looks nice and neat, and also just finish pressing the rest of our corset. Once that's done, we are just going to mark our grommets. I'm using a 1/4 inch grommet, and they are starting 0.5 inches from the top, and they are 1 inch apart. You do not have to use my grommet sizing or what's marked on the pattern, but this is the sizing and the grommet spacing that I have done. And then I'm going to go over to my grommet press. You can also use a grommet kit off Amazon, and I'm just going to put in my grommets. And this is actually your very last step besides lacing up your corset and trying it on. I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial and sew along video. Make sure you follow along for new pattern releases and more tutorials. Thank you guys.